What if I told you that 500 years before Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered America, blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors were already building settlements, trading with natives and establishing the first European foothold in the New World? And then, they just left. They abandoned what could have been the greatest colonial empire in history and sailed back to the frozen fjords of Scandinavia. Why? The answer will completely change how you think about American history. By the end of this video, you'll understand the real reason why your history books lied to you about who truly discovered America, and why the Vikings made a decision that altered the course of human civilization forever. Picture this. It's the year 1000 AD. While most of Europe is struggling through the Dark Ages, Viking longships are cutting through the icy waters of the North Atlantic. These aren't just raiders anymore. They're explorers, settlers, families seeking new lands. And they're about to find something that will make them richer and more powerful than any European nation for the next 5 centuries, but they'll throw it all away. This is the story of Leif Erikson, the man who beat Columbus to America by half a millennium. But more importantly, it's the story of why his people walked away from paradise. Let me ask you something. If you discovered a land flowing with timber, grapes, salmon, and fertile soil, would you abandon it? If you found a continent with no organized armies to stop you, no diseases to kill you, and resources beyond your wildest dreams, would you just leave? The Vikings did exactly that, and the reason why will shock you, but first let's destroy everything you think you know about how Europeans discovered America. Columbus didn't discover America. I know, you learned this in school. But here's the thing your textbooks conveniently forgot to mention. European explorers had been reaching American shores for centuries before Columbus was even born. And the proof isn't hidden in some dusty archive. It's literally carved in stone. In 1960, archaeologists in Newfoundland uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Meadows. The remains of a genuine Viking settlement, complete with workshops, living quarters, and artifacts that could only have come from Scandinavia. This wasn't some accidental landing, this was a planned colony built to last. But here's where it gets interesting. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon America by accident. This was the culmination of the most ambitious exploration project in medieval history. And it started with a man whose temper would literally change the course of world history. Meet Erik the Red. This guy was so violent that he got banished from not one, but 2 different countries. First Norway, then Iceland. When you're too much trouble for the Vikings, you know you're a problem. But Erik's exile would become America's discovery. Kicked out of Iceland in 982 AD, Erik sailed west into the unknown Atlantic. What he found was a massive island covered in ice, but with pockets of green valleys perfect for farming. He called it Greenland. Not because it was green, but because he was history's first real estate scammer. Erik knew that if he called it Icy Death Island, nobody would want to move there. His marketing worked. Within 15 years, Erik had convinced over 3,000 Vikings to abandon their comfortable homes in Iceland and Norway to start fresh in Greenland. These weren't desperate refugees. These were farmers, craftsmen, traders, warriors, the Viking elite, and they thrived. But Erik's son, Leif Erikson, had bigger dreams, much bigger. Around the year 1000, Leif heard stories from other sailors, stories of lands even further west, lands with forests so thick you couldn't see the sky, lands with grapes growing wild, lands with salmon so numerous they jumped into your boat. Leif assembled a crew of 35 men and sailed into the unknown. What happened next would make him the true discoverer of America. 500 years before Columbus ever left Spain. They found it, not just one land, but three distinct regions. First, a rocky, barren coast they called Helluland, the land of flat stones. Today, we know this as Baffin Island. Then Markland, the forest land, probably Labrador. And finally, the crown jewel, Vinland, the land of grapes. Vinland was everything the Vikings had dreamed of and more. Endless forests for shipbuilding, rivers teeming with salmon, wild grapes for wine, grasslands perfect for cattle, no kings to serve, no taxes to pay, no enemies to fight. It was paradise. Leif and his crew spent the winter there, building shelters, exploring, mapping the coastline. When spring came, they loaded their ship with timber and grapes and sailed back to Greenland as heroes. Leif had found the promised land. Now here's what every history book gets wrong about what happened next. They make it sound like the Vikings tried to colonize America but failed because of native resistance. That's complete nonsense. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. The Vikings didn't fail to colonize America, they chose to abandon it. And the reason why reveals a dark truth about human nature that historians have been trying to hide for 1,000 years. After Leif's successful voyage, the news spread like wildfire through the Greenland settlements. America was real, it was rich, and it was practically empty. Viking families began organizing expeditions immediately. This wasn't going to be a few trading posts. This was going to be a full-scale colonization effort that would establish Viking America centuries before any other European power even knew the continent existed. Leif's brother Thorvald led the second expedition around 1002. 30 men planning to establish a permanent base in Vinland. Everything went perfectly for 2 years. They explored the coastline, they built longhouses, they established contact with the native peoples. But then something happened that changed everything. Thorvald made a decision that would doom Viking America forever. During one of their explorations, Thorvald's crew encountered a group of Native Americans. These weren't warriors, they weren't threatening, they were just there, living their lives, probably as surprised to see Vikings as the Vikings were to see them. And Thorvald ordered his men to kill them, all of them, for no reason other than they weren't Vikings. This wasn't self-defense, this wasn't a territorial dispute, this was cold-blooded murder, and it set off a chain reaction that would ultimately drive the Vikings from America forever. But here's the part that will really shock you. The native retaliation that followed wasn't what drove the Vikings away. No, what happened next reveals something much darker about Viking society. Word of Thorvald's massacre spread quickly among the native tribes. Not surprisingly, they organized a response. When the Vikings next encountered natives, it wasn't peaceful traders they met. It was warriors, ready for battle. Thorvald himself was killed in the fighting, struck down by an arrow. But here's what's incredible. His death didn't end Viking exploration of America. If anything, it intensified it. Thorfinn Karlsefni, one of the wealthiest men in Greenland, organized the largest Viking expedition to America in 1010. This wasn't just an exploration. This was a full-scale colonization effort. Over 160 settlers, including women and children, livestock, tools, everything needed to establish a permanent Viking colony in the New World. And for 3 years, it worked perfectly. Karlsefni's expedition established a thriving settlement in Vinland. They built houses, cleared farmland, established trade relationships with local tribes. Children were born in Viking America. The first European children born in the New World. 5 centuries before anyone you've ever heard of. The settlement was so successful that Karlsefni sent ships back to Greenland loaded with American timber, furs, and other goods. Viking America was becoming profitable, very profitable. So why did they abandon it? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't native resistance, it wasn't disease, it wasn't lack of resources, it was something much more fundamental, much more human, and much more tragic. The Vikings abandoned America because they couldn't stop fighting each other. Here's what really happened in Viking America. As the settlement grew successful, different Viking families began competing for control. Not control over the natives, not control over resources, but control over each other. The same petty feuds and power struggles that had driven Erik the Red from Norway and Iceland followed the Vikings across the Atlantic. Karlsefni found himself spending more time mediating disputes between Viking families than actually building the colony. Feuds over land ownership, feuds over trade rights, feuds over social status. The Vikings had found paradise, and they were destroying it with their own hands. But here's where it gets really tragic. The final blow to Viking America wasn't delivered by native warriors or harsh winters or lack of supplies. It was delivered by Viking women. The saga of Erik the Red tells us something remarkable about the end of Viking America. The women in Karlsefni's colony began to refuse to stay. Not because of hardship, not because of danger, but because they missed home. They missed their families, their friends, their familiar way of life. And in Viking society, when the women decided something, that was it. Families began leaving. One by one, ship by ship, the colonists abandoned their successful settlement and sailed back to Greenland. By 1013, Viking America was a ghost town. But wait, there's more to this story. Something that makes the Viking abandonment of America even more tragic. Remember, this is happening in the early 11th century. This is 300 years before the Mongol Empire, 400 years before the Black Death, 500 years before Columbus. The Vikings had a head start on colonizing the New World that should have made them the dominant power in human history. Imagine if Viking America had survived. Imagine if by 1492 Columbus had arrived in the New World to find not scattered native tribes, but a powerful Viking empire stretching from Greenland to Mexico. Imagine if the conquest of the Americas had been a war between Vikings and Spanish conquistadors. The Vikings threw away the chance to rule half the world. But here's something even more incredible. Even after Karlsefni's colony failed, the Vikings didn't completely abandon America. For the next 3 centuries, Viking ships continued making regular voyages to America, not to colonize, but to harvest resources. They called these expeditions Markland voyages, and they were incredibly profitable. Vikings would sail to America, cut down trees, hunt for furs, trade with natives, and return to Greenland with their ships full of American goods. It was like having a private continent they could plunder whenever they needed resources. These voyages continued regularly until the 1300s. That's 3 centuries of regular contact between Europe and America, completely unknown to the rest of the world. The Vikings were running their own private trade route to the New World while the rest of Europe didn't even know America existed. So why did even these limited voyages eventually stop? The answer reveals the final tragedy of the Viking discovery of America. Climate change killed Viking America. Not modern climate change, but the Little Ice Age that began in the 13th century. As the world grew colder, the sea routes between Greenland and America became increasingly dangerous. Ice flows made navigation treacherous, storms became more violent, and voyages that had once been routine became life-threatening gambles. But even more importantly, the cooling climate was destroying the Greenland colonies themselves. The farms that had supported 3,000 Vikings were failing. Crops wouldn't grow, livestock died, and the Greenland Vikings began abandoning their settlements. By 1400, the last Viking colonist in Greenland was dead. The entire Viking presence in the North Atlantic had collapsed. When Columbus reached America in 1492, there wasn't a single Viking left alive who remembered the Markland voyages. The Vikings had discovered America, colonized America, traded with America, and then vanished from America completely, leaving barely a trace of their presence. But here's the question that haunts historians. What if they hadn't left? Think about this seriously for a moment. What if the Vikings had stuck it out in America? What if they had overcome their petty feuds and established a permanent presence in the New World? By 1492, Viking America would have had nearly 5 centuries to develop. 5 centuries to explore the continent, to establish cities, to develop agriculture, to build trade networks with native peoples. When Columbus arrived, he would have encountered not scattered tribes, but a powerful Viking nation that had been in America longer than any European nation had existed in Europe. The Spanish conquistadors who conquered the Aztec and Inca empires would have faced an entirely different challenge. Battle-hardened Vikings who knew every inch of American terrain and had 5 centuries of experience fighting on American soil. The entire colonial period would have been completely different. Instead of European powers dividing up an empty continent, they would have been fighting an established Viking empire for control of America. But there's an even more profound implication. The Vikings didn't just abandon land in America, they abandoned people. Remember, Viking children were born in America. Some of those children grew up, had children of their own, and chose to stay when their families returned to Greenland. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Vikings integrated into native communities and remained in America permanently. What happened to them? What happened to their descendants? The answer is both fascinating and tragic. Recent genetic studies have found traces of European DNA in several Native American populations, particularly in the northeastern regions where Viking settlements were established. These genetic markers aren't from later European colonization. They're older, much older. Some Vikings never left America. They stayed. They intermarried with native peoples, and their bloodlines survive in Native American communities to this day. The Viking discovery of America didn't end with the abandonment of the colonies. It ended with Vikings becoming Americans 5 centuries before America was even called America. But here's what really makes this story tragic. The Vikings who stayed, who integrated, who became part of Native American society, were eventually conquered by the very European powers their own ancestors could have stopped. When English colonists arrived in Massachusetts, when French trappers explored the Great Lakes, when Spanish conquistadors marched through Mexico, they were conquering lands that Vikings had once claimed. They were displacing peoples who carried Viking blood in their veins. The descendants of Viking America were conquered by Europe. Now let me ask you something. After everything I've told you, do you still think Columbus discovered America? Do you still think European colonization of the New World was inevitable? The Vikings proved that European colonization of America was not only possible centuries earlier than anyone imagined, but profitable, sustainable, and successful. They proved that Europeans could work with Native Americans, could establish thriving colonies, could build a New World empire that might have lasted forever. and they threw it all away because they couldn't stop fighting each other. The real tragedy of Viking America isn't that they failed to colonize the New World. The real tragedy is that they succeeded and then abandoned their success for the most human of reasons. They valued their petty conflicts more than their incredible opportunity. But there's one more twist to this story that most historians won't tell you. The Viking abandonment of America might have been the greatest mistake in human history, but it wasn't the end of Viking influence on the New World. Because 500 years later, when other European powers did begin colonizing America, they were following Viking routes, using Viking knowledge, and settling in areas that Vikings had already mapped. Columbus might have gotten the credit, but he was following in Viking footsteps every step of the way. The proof is literally written in the stars. Viking navigation techniques, passed down through Norse sailing traditions, were still being used by European navigators in Columbus's time. The same stellar navigation methods that brought Leif Erikson to America guided Columbus across the Atlantic 5 centuries later. Even the name America might be connected to the Vikings. Some historians argue that America doesn't come from Amerigo Vespucci at all, but from the Norse phrase Omerika, meaning farthest outland. The Vikings might have literally given America its name. So here's the final question. What can we learn from the Viking discovery and abandonment of America? First, that the history you learned in school is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. The Vikings didn't just raid monasteries and burn villages. They were sophisticated explorers who accomplished one of the greatest feats in human history: the discovery and colonization of a new continent. Second, that success isn't just about achievement, it's about sustaining achievement. The Vikings didn't fail to reach America, they failed to stay in America. And they failed to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with external challenges and everything to do with internal conflicts. Third, that individual decisions can change the course of human history in ways we never imagine. If Thorvald hadn't massacred those natives, if the Viking colonists had resolved their feuds, if the women had chosen to stay, the entire history of the modern world would be different. And finally, that the greatest opportunities in life often come disguised as difficult choices. The Vikings had the chance to rule an empire, to reshape human civilization, to become the dominant power in world history. But it would have required them to change who they were, to overcome their nature, to choose cooperation over conflict. They chose to remain Vikings instead of becoming something greater. The question is, when your moment comes, what will you choose? The Vikings discovered America 500 years before Columbus, built successful colonies, established profitable trade routes, and had the opportunity to create the greatest empire in human history. And they walked away from all of it. That's not failure, that's tragedy. But their loss was history's gain because it reminds us that success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about what you do with your achievements. It's about whether you can rise above your own nature to seize the opportunities life presents. The Vikings couldn't. The question is, can you? If this video has changed how you think about American history, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what other historical myths you want me to destroy next time. And if you want to learn more about how individual decisions shape the course of human civilization, check out my video about the Roman emperor who made his horse a senator and why that decision actually made perfect sense. Until next time, remember, history isn't what they taught you in school. History is what actually happened, and what actually happened is always more incredible than the official story.